In the intricate tapestry of the criminal underworld, where ambition and danger weave unbreakable destinies, a figure as elusive as she was powerful emerged. She was born in the cradle of mafias, a land where destiny, they say, is a shadow from which no one can escape. But did she truly want to? Or was ignorance, the pose of innocence, just a mask for justice that, astonishingly, sided with her many times? This is the story of Sandra Ávila Beltrán, a woman whose name is whispered with a mix of respect and fear, a figure whose mystique inspired fictions that enraged her, a story that takes us into the depths of an underworld where questions outweigh answers. Was she just a victim of circumstances, or does she hide much more than she lets on? This is the tale of the woman who defied cartels, presidents, and Netflix itself. Sandra Ávila Beltrán came into the world on October 11, 1960 in Sinaloa. Her origin from the beginning was marked by crime, but it wasn't just any criminal life. She came from a long line of drug traffickers. It was always whispered that her maternal uncle was none other than Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, the boss of bosses, although some voices deny it. The families, however, were always very close, beyond blood ties. Sandra's father also maintained ties with figures like Rafael Caro Quintero, co-founder of the Guadalajara cartel, along with Felix Gallardo and Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo. Throughout Sandra's childhood and youth, the Ávila Beltrán family lived a very comfortable life with plenty of money. They weren't exactly good at making money legally. Instead, they made it through illegal businesses that ran alongside the family's real businesses, 2 hardware stores and a ranch in Culiacan. Sandra grew up with way too many fancy things, a life where she could get anything she wanted, knowing she belonged to a group that no one could touch. But, according to some stories, she also knew the dark side of life. She didn't live in a bubble. One of her grandmothers lived in the poorer parts of town, in one of the most dangerous areas of Culiacan, where crime was really bad. So Sandra got to see both sides of drug trafficking firsthand, the fancy life of those in charge and the brutal violence needed to keep that power on the streets. Faced with that scene, which stretched out like a dark shadow, several of Sandra's siblings decided to leave as soon as possible. They went their separate ways, escaping the tentacles of drug trafficking. But Sandra didn't. She preferred to stay, willing to survive based on cunning and, who knows, perhaps some concessions. From a very young age, she already knew she had a disappeared uncle, a man who had vanished into the night and never returned. The family didn't investigate, they simply accepted that he wouldn't come back. He would be the first of many crimes and mysteries that would condemn Sandra's family to an unstoppable spiral of deaths. And despite everything, she remained in the place where she was born, willing to earn the respect of her surroundings, and of course she would. They say that to truly know someone, you must understand their origin. But, well, what happens when that origin is steeped in a darkness that refuses to fade away? Sandra's story cannot be separated from the family line that shaped her. An uncle who disappeared without a trace in the night, vanishing in the morning. The family, with an unexplainable acceptance, never looked into what happened and simply knew he wouldn't come back. It would be the first of many crimes and mysteries that would lead to a never-ending string of deaths for Sandra's family. Was this a sign of what was to come for her, or did young Sandra try, at least for a while, to write her own story? There was a moment when our protagonist tried to live a different life, though not too far from her usual opulence. With her jewels and luxury car in tow, without trying to hide her lifestyle, Sandra moved to Guadalajara. Her goal, to study the career that, according to her, she was passionate about: journalism. She claimed to have felt a strong interest in the profession from a very young age, and she didn't hesitate to enroll in 1978 in communication sciences at the Autonomous University of Guadalajara. During those years, Sandra was just another student. However, some details made her stand out from her peers. She maintained a carefully low profile, was quiet but tended to be solitary, and curiously, she was late to all her classes. Academically, she wasn't among the best. She didn't stand out for her grades, but she kept up. Her classmates quickly noticed something peculiar. Even though she wasn't very chatty, everyone was struck by the room full of fancy jewelry and clothes that not everyone could get, which didn't seem to belong to a regular student. From then on, some of her classmates started to think that her wealth might come from something bad. Those same jewels were what made many people keep their distance from her. If, as they believed, the quiet Sandra was connected to the drug world, it was better to stay away from her. But the young woman, it seemed, tried to live a normal life and get her degree, until destiny called her again. In fact, Sandra Ávila Beltrán never worked as a reporter. The reason? Much more promising businesses and somewhat unusual ones appeared on her horizon. Her first boyfriend would mark the beginning of a dark tradition in all the relationships this woman would have. Although he seemed like a trustworthy guy, things would soon take an unexpected and, as we'll see, violent turn. In the game of life, certain choices can seal a destiny. For Sandra, the search for love turned into a dark tradition, a premonition of tragedies. Her first boyfriend, a young man who at first seemed trustworthy, would soon show his darker side. On an uncertain date, but one that has been recounted in several books about Sandra's enigmatic life, the young woman was at home with her sisters, her sister-in-law and her father. Suddenly, her boyfriend's brother knocked on the door asking her to come out and talk. When she did, Sandra was met with a surprise. Her boyfriend was waiting for her outside, accompanied by 3 men. In a matter of seconds, the scene turned into a kidnapping. Her screams alerted the family, who immediately came out to try and save her. Shots were heard, but nothing could be done. Sandra had been taken from the place. On the way to a ranch, her own boyfriend, who turned out to be the nephew of Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, alias Don Nato and founder of the Guadalajara cartel, held her captive. His objective was a millionaire ransom without considering the consequences. But Sandra's family was completely involved in the drug trafficking business. It was her own father-in-law who would become the unexpected savior. That man forced Sandra's boyfriend to release her, stopping at the root what could have escalated to unthinkable levels. Much more experienced in that world, he wanted to avoid a drug war. Sandra thus discovered that associating with certain men could be extremely dangerous. However, a few years later, she was sure she had found the one when she married Luis Fuentes Jimenez. He was a commander of the Federal Judicial Police of Baja California and seemed like a really good person. Or, at least, that's how he wanted to appear. The truth is, shortly after getting married, they went to Bolivia to start a new life. By that time, they already had their son, Jose Luis. They were doing well and were a close family, a picture of a perfect life. But a phone call would erase that image. Sandra's husband warned her that their family was in danger and that they had to run away as fast as they could. So they did, but for Luis it was already too late. Soon after, he would be shot and killed at his own ranch. The people who wrote about the Queen of the Pacific think that the man was involved in selling drugs and that it might have been a fight between different security groups. For Sandra, this death would be the start of her own personal war, because Luis's brothers would see her as an enemy. They were really mad about all the money Sandra got after her husband died and promised to get back at her. They tried to attack her many times, but they never managed to kill her. Sandra always thought they were behind the attempts to hurt her, but everything happened outside the law, and that's how it would stay. Sometime later, Sandra found another love in Rodolfo El Zurdo López Amavisca, also a man connected to law enforcement. He was a former agent of the National Anti-Drug Institute, but his end would be marked by a new tragedy. After 5 years as a couple, health problems began to affect Amavisca. First, a rectal surgery got complicated, causing him gangrene. He had a slow and long recovery, hospitalized and receiving continuous visits from his wife. It was after one of those meetings that Sandra felt her husband suspected something. On that last day, Rodolfo gave her jewelry as if he was saying goodbye. Sandra left the hospital feeling a bit uneasy and knew her gut feeling wouldn't fail her when she saw trucks parked near the health center. She didn't turn back. That morning, around 10 o'clock, she received a call at home. They told her that a commando unit had entered the hospital, killed the security guard and gone straight to the room where Rodolfo was resting. With a knife and a precise stab, they had taken his life. By then, figuring out who wanted to attack Sandra's inner circle was a difficult task. She would later claim that she had no idea about her partner's shady dealings and that she was completely unaware of why misfortune constantly appeared around her. But looking at the whole picture, the death of her two husbands was no mere coincidence. It seemed that everyone around Sandra was doomed to suffer in terrible ways. If we look at the people who met a dark end just because they were related to the Ávila Beltrán family, we could make a whole separate video. Besides that uncle who disappeared without a trace when Sandra was very little, one of her brothers met a similar fate. The boy was one of the clan members who hadn't gotten away from the bad vibe that was in the family. Until he met his end suddenly. While he was home with his daughter, he was violently kidnapped with another man. A few hours later, his body was found a short distance away with signs of having been tortured and finally suffocated. The Ávila Beltrán family received the news with sadness, but also with resignation. Just like with that uncle, there were no more questions. It was never known who had attacked them in such a ruthless way. They only knew that this crime had the clear mark of the mafias. When Sandra tried to rebuild her family life with her first husband, misfortunes happened again, but in this case, well, without the drug trafficking world being directly involved. After having her first child, Sandra became pregnant again and, according to later investigations, digging into little-known facts about her life, the baby was lost. Not many more details were known, but that marked her from then on. Sandra was determined to protect the child she still had, and she managed to keep her promise for quite some time. But fate, always unpredictable, lurked in the shadows. The most primal instinct, protecting your child. For Sandra, this became her most sacred promise. But in a world where shadows lurk, how long can one escape? Everything seemed to fall into an abyss on April 18th, 2002. For a moment, Sandra thought that the only thing she had left in life would also disappear forever. That day, José Luis, her son, was at a gym when a group of masked men kidnapped him and took him away. The boy was only 14 years old, so it was clear that his kidnapping was to send a strong message to his family, especially to his mother. When she found out, Sandra started to feel really desperate. She went to the Attorney General's office in Jalisco, even though it was risky for her to ask for help. A few hours later, the kidnappers called her to talk about how they wanted to negotiate. They told her they were demanding $5 million to release the young man safe and sound. They gave proof that the kidnapping was real and they were serious. If Sandra didn't pay, her son would end up dead. The first contact between the kidnappers and Sandra happened at midnight on the day of the incident, but that whole situation would end up lasting for 18 endless days. The kidnappers always showed themselves and told Sandra that this was simply a business deal and that everything depended on the payment. Sandra was afraid that things would get out of hand at any moment. She could barely talk or think straight, so she asked one of her brothers to help her with getting the ransom money ready. The talks were actually working out. The kidnappers lowered what they were asking for, and finally, it seemed like they agreed to a deal. So, with the money in hand, Sandra's brother started on the risky job of making the exchange. Over the phone, a kidnapper's voice guided him along the road to Chapala, heading to the meeting spot where that nightmare would finally end. At home, Sandra was eagerly waiting for news. Finally, at 6 in the evening on May 5th, 2002, the doorbell rang. Her son had just arrived, completely alone, in a taxi. The woman finally breathed a sigh of relief. The payment had reached its destination and José Luis had survived. Years later, he would say that his biggest fear during the days of the kidnapping was that his son would see the faces of his kidnappers. But that didn't happen. The teenager spent 18 days blindfolded. He wasn't beaten or hurt in any way. For the first time, a good sign of good luck appeared in Sandra's life. but the good luck wouldn't last long. Sandra, a woman who had always stayed out of the spotlight and who, whenever the chance came up, tried to be related to drug traffickers but wanted a life completely separate from that, made a very naive mistake. As we said, during her son's kidnapping, she had gone to the Attorney General's office. Something that would end up condemning her. The authorities followed her case closely and found the amount of money the woman was able to gather in less than a month suspicious. From then on, they began to follow her every move. In a short time, they would discover how to catch her. The shadow of fate once again loomed over the Queen. Once again, her romantic partner was a key piece in this story of tragedies. In 2007, Sandra had started dating Juan Diego Espinosa Ramirez, known as El Tigre. He was known for being a leader of the Sinaloa cartel and a central figure in triangulating cocaine from Colombia to the United States, the main consumer market. To move 70 tons of drugs every month, this drug trafficker needed resources, protection, and helpers. And Sandra, with her smarts and her connections, had everything needed to make the business happen. Tracking the calls between Sandra and her partner quickly led authorities to Ignacio Coronel and Ismael El Mayo Zambada, two top-level drug lords. It was impossible for Sandra to keep saying she didn't know where her money came from. To shape this investigation, the U.S. anti-drug agency, the DEA, directly intervened. The relationship and contact chart was already set. All that was missing was a big hit to completely dismantle the organization. The numbers started going up. The DEA believed that Sandra was involved in laundering about $22.5 million, which came from drug trafficking and was put into real estate. And it all ended on July 21st, 2002, when a ship was seized that was trying to carry 9 tons of pure cocaine in the port of Manzanillo. That was the final proof investigators needed to go after Sandra. But how did this amazing drug trafficking operation unfold step by step? From the moment the ship set sail, the crew members knew they had something strange on their hands. Soon after the journey began, one of the witnesses, who had approached the ship without knowing the true intentions of the voyage, was told that they weren't going fishing. The tuna boat, which was called Maisel, sailed without GPS to remain undetectable. Automatically, the crew members received money in exchange for their silence and for not asking questions. When they got the cargo in the hold, some of the crew heard a growing rumor. There were undercover agents on the ship. What few knew was that a helicopter was flying overhead following the ship's path. Soon after, the Maisel was boarded by another ship with an American flag. The operation was over, and with it, Sandra's fate. On the morning of her arrest, Sandra had a dream. In it, shadows were chasing her. She woke up with a bad feeling, like something terrible was about to happen. She had planned to have breakfast with friends that morning, but she stayed nervous and on edge the whole time. A woman on the phone near her made her feel like she was being watched. Finally, as she was leaving, a car pulled up in front of her. Shadows like those in her dream appeared from behind. What was about to happen, far from being a dream, was very real. They asked her if she was Sandra Ávila Beltrán and then showed her an extradition order. They arrested her for being involved in illegal activities linked to international drug trafficking. During the questioning, Sandra kept saying she had no idea what was happening to her. She said she was just a simple housewife. This is what she said before, during, and after her years in prison. She spent some time in the Santa Marta Acatitla Women's Prison, which is in Mexico City. There she found out what it meant to have a different life, totally opposite to the one she had lived until then. There were no fancy restaurants, no jewelry, no high-end cars. Over time, Sandra filed a complaint with human rights organizations, but she didn't report abuse or torture, but rather that there were insects in her cell and she wasn't given gourmet food. That's how the next 7 years went for the controversial woman. When she was extradited to the United States, for a moment she felt like her life was falling apart, because sentences for drug traffickers there are usually very harsh. But against the predictions of many who already saw her as condemned before her trial, Sandra couldn't be proven guilty of any crime related to being a drug trafficker. She was declared not guilty of that crime, but rather of financing someone, in this case her partner, who was connected to crime. Specifically, they sentenced her to 70 months, but with the chance to ask for parole starting in 2013. So on February 7th, 2015, she went back abroad, completely free from all accusations and charges, ready to start a new life, but far from fame. Away from fame? No, that was impossible. When she took back control of her life, Sandra was already much more exposed than before. Arturo Pérez Reverte's novel, The Queen of the South, had come out several years earlier in 2002, but with Sandra's imprisonment, it gained even more fame. The main character in the book seemed to be completely inspired by her, so much so that Sandra herself started to be called by that name. So the fictional character of Teresa Mendoza began to blur the line between fiction and reality. But Sandra didn't like this situation, and things got worse when Netflix and Telemundo aired a TV show based on the book. On its premiere date, March 14, 2011, the first episode was the most watched in Telemundo's history. The fact that the main streaming platform added it to its catalogue made its popularity skyrocket even more. Most importantly, Sandra wasn't getting a single penny for the use of what she believed, without a doubt, was her own image. So, in an even bolder move, the woman decided to sue both TV networks. She asked for 40% of the show's earnings, which had over 100 episodes. Even though the case is still ongoing, the court might not agree with what the former prisoner is asking for. After all, both the show's creators and the author of the original book have said that it's a made-up story and not a true biography. They also said they didn't know Sandra before creating the main character, and that the story is based on public tales about drug trafficking without being about one specific person. Even so, Sandra knew how to use the attention to her own benefit. Out of prison, but with her honor questioned, she had no choice but to reinvent herself. And what better way than social media to show the world exactly the story Sandra wants people to know about her. As of recording this video, if we check Sandra Ávila Beltrán's social media, it doesn't seem like we're talking about a woman many call the queen of the drug trade. Other interests seem to guide her life. Interests much more in line with today's internet content. Transformed into an influencer, Sandra spends her time talking about fashion, food, horses, and the high-class life she's been used to for decades. As if her 7 years in prison were just an unlucky break in what should have always been different. At 64, she says she's left the drug world behind and no longer hides from the public eye. But her unexpected fame is exploding internationally. Of course, this is helped by the accidental publicity from that much-talked-about series. The new Sandra gives interviews on television. She talks openly about her past, and she promotes her upcoming projects. In January 2025, she was a guest on Chismes TV Mexico. She said that the only project she hadn't done yet was to work as a journalist. She said she always wanted her life to be as far away as possible from the crime that surrounded her family. But she blamed her downfall on fate, always calling her back. Even though she no longer says she was completely innocent of everything, she says she didn't have the life she truly expected for herself. In a way, she continues to say she was a victim of circumstances and that she was stuck in a role she wanted to escape as soon as possible. And her complaints aren't just about Netflix. They've gone much further, claiming that the persecution against her has always been politically motivated. She also stated that former Mexican President Felipe Calderón was always involved in drug trafficking. She described him as a drunk, a misogynist and an addict. It's no coincidence that Sandra's arrest happened during his term. The truth is, on social media, she seems to be getting back into communication, and she's followed by thousands of people who are interested in her content. Finally, she decided to choose her own path. She announced the launch of a clothing line, specifically blouses, in partnership with the Mexican brand Block. This is an exclusive series from the brand Cuadra La Reina, embroidered with gold thread and a crown. She offers them in white, black and red, and she hopes this is the start of a new chapter. And it seems her over 100,000 followers are ready to join her on this journey. Will she get a second chance, or will fate come knocking at her door and once again she won't be able to resist following what seems to be the terrible legacy of the Ávila Beltráns? And so the story of Sandra Ávila Beltrán, the Queen of the South, closes, at least for now. It leaves us with a lingering echo, a complex melody of ambition, tragedy and survival. Was she truly a simple housewife, dragged along by an unavoidable fate, as she herself claimed? Or did her choices, knowingly or unknowingly, lead her to embrace the legacy of a family made of shadows? Her life, a whirlwind of luxury and misfortune, makes us think, how much can we really escape where we come from? When money comes from bad things, is it a curtain that hides the truth, or a fancy cage you can't get out of? The Queen of the South is back, turning her bad reputation into a new kind of power, dancing to the beat of social media. Is this freedom a real fresh start, or just another part of the tricky dance between who she is and who she pretends to be? Her challenging big media companies, her calling out powerful people, reminds us that stories have many layers and the truth often hides in the shadows. In a world where fake things mix with real life and fame can be a double-edged sword, Sandra Ávila Beltrán's path tells us a clear lesson. Nothing is easy, especially when you're dealing with the wild ride of destiny. And maybe the real question isn't if Sandra got a second chance, but if the legacy of the Ávila Beltrán family, that dark shadow she was born into, will ever stop knocking at her door. Thank you so much for being with us. We've passed 3,000 subscribers, so thank you very, very much. As always, for any suggestions, we read your comments, and don't forget to subscribe to what we call Stories of Wonder. See you next time.